Of all the places you might expect a story about a night shift to take place, a garden center probably wouldn't be high on your list of possibilities. Still, this is Vegas, and things are different here. For most folks, something about a place where people buy plants, turf fertilizer, and garden ornaments screams daytime shopping, probably because the products people buy are for their gardens, and gardens are mostly used in the daylight. In any other city, the idea of a round-the-clock garden supply store probably wouldn't work, but considering this is the same town that has a 24-hour drive-through taxidermist, anything is possible. At Citrinis Garden Supplies, we were open 24 hours a day, and hard as it may be to believe we did get the customers. Though things were obviously much slower at night, some evenings we genuinely would have a steady trickle of night owls buying bedding plants, small trees and fertilizer at 3 in the morning. Often, though, as you would expect, the place would be silent aside from the sounds of sprinklers or the moisture jets going off inside the greenhouses. On nights like those, I'm happy to admit, Citrinis could be a creepy place to work. Having all those leaves and branches fracturing and obscuring the light could make for some strange moving shadows, not to mention the rustling whispers you'd hear whenever a breeze fluttered between them. On those nights, I often wished that Joe, the owner, would put more than one member of staff on his night shifts. It was on one of those nights, standing alone amongst the leaves and whispers, that I heard a sound that was not a sprinkler or a breeze. This sound was the rasp and scrape of a shovel nicking and cutting into turf and gravel, the sound of someone digging. Looking out from my station behind the counter, at first I couldn't see anyone, but glancing up at the CCTV monitors, I saw a man, hunched over in a spot close to the front entrance, with spade in hand and what looked like a huge bundle of sheets by his side. Now obviously the garden centre encouraged people who enjoyed gardening, but it didn't encourage them to dig up or plant things on the property itself, especially at 4 a.m, so I went to investigate. What I found when I arrived at the spot was an old man standing over what looked to be quite a surprisingly deep hole. He had put the shovel down by this point and was struggling with some heavy load wrapped in a large red blanket, a load which as I approached I realized was the carcass of an enormous black dog. The head, which was protruding from the blanket, was unusually large and belonged to some kind of mongrel breed that I couldn't identify. When I asked what the hell he was doing, the guy at first didn't answer. He simply pitched the body into the hole and then turned to pick up the spade. Eventually he came back to face me and said, "Joe asked me to put the grim in." When I said I had no idea what he was talking about and that he couldn't just bury his dead animals here, he chuckled. "There'll be worse than him buried here, Sonny. That's the point. If you ain't up to speed, you could ask Joe. Though I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you genuinely don't know who you're working for." I walked away. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Fight the guy? Call the cops? Instead, I messaged Joe, told him what had happened, and asked if he was okay with it. His answer was one word: okay. Over the next few nights, there were no silences. Though there were no customers, the air was filled with a long, baleful howling. Though I walked the perimeter and checked the screens, no dogs could be seen. But they could be heard. Howling, barking, and at times growling, far closer than I was comfortable with. A few weeks later, I looked up the words grim, buried, and dog. The results did not reassure me. In mythology, it said, there is a tradition that the first person buried at a burial ground would be responsible after death for defending it against any intruders, be they spirits, demons, or the devil himself. To avoid any human soul being forced into such a position, the builders of any new churchyard would ensure that a dog was the first to be buried on the grounds. These church grims were then set to protect the dead from disturbance. This led to many legends of huge black dogs and wolves spotted in churchyards. I remember reading that and feeling a chill run down my spine. At the same time, the logical part of me said that the story didn't apply to me. This was no churchyard or burial plot. It was a basic garden supply store. Only of course it wasn't. It was 2 years later, and 18 months after I quit the job, that Joe Citrini was arrested and charged with multiple homicides. Apparently, he had deep connections to one of the biggest crime families in Vegas. I knew nothing about that when I took the job, nor do I know where the bodies of the 15 people he is alleged to have killed are buried, but I could definitely hazard a guess. Citrini's was closed down and taken over by another company that only opens during daylight hours. Though I do hear that at night, the locals still report awful sounds like the howling of some kind of dog coming from that very same spot, probably defending those who sleep there from the things that want to take them. Night shifts at the library only came around twice a year, in the run-up to big examination periods. The library itself was on campus, and though the professors and faculty would tell the students that cramming for an exam was a stupid thing to do and no substitute for long-term learning, they also made sure that the libraries were open, so that the very same process of cramming could take place right up until the day of the exams. The two big periods during which the library was open 24 hours was a 6-week period in June and July, and a month period in late November into December. As a postgrad student who worked as librarian to pay my tuition fees when I wasn't in class, I was expected to work night shifts during both of these stretches, and that's exactly what I did, though I can tell you right now that the stretch in winter, the one in November to December, was far worse than the one in summer. In June and July, the place was packed, not only because the finals were perceived as being more important, but because it was hot. The library windows were open, everyone had an iced drink, and the atmosphere in those light nights was generally quite upbeat. A lot of the students would come to the library and do a few hours study until the early hours, and then go out drinking with friends, or off to a hastily arranged party at one of their student houses, carrying their book bags with them. The winter was different. The university library was an old pre-Victorian building with a new modern section attached clumsily to it. In the older parts, the winter was unforgiving. The plumbing was ancient, so the heating system rarely worked. The place was stone-built and drafty, so the cold would get in and stay like an unwanted lodger, and the entire place seemed to be eternally damp and dark. Students, preferring not to come out in the cold and rain, didn't venture out to the library in anywhere near as many numbers, meaning that on a lot of nights, in the older sections especially, the place was almost deserted. On those days, or rather nights, the place was creepy. On the 6th floor, amongst the stacks of theology and comparative religion, where not many students ventured, and where many of the books were older than the building they were sitting in, there was always a lingering atmosphere. Walking amongst the rows of shelves, cataloguing and replacing volumes, you would often hear noises, the creaking of the wooden shelves, the wind whistling and moaning as it gnawed at the edges of the building, and sometimes closer, more familiar sounds. Many times when I'd been alone up there, certain that there was not another soul on that entire level, I would nevertheless hear the sounds of other souls, footsteps, where no feet were walking, weary sighs and slow, heavy breathing on the other side of a shelf that, when I turned the corner, showed no lips that might have made such a sound. Instead, just long rows of bookshelves, dimly lit by the small desk bulbs that threw much of the place into deep shadow, and at times seemed to make those shadows move. I often thought it was an issue with my eyes, that by focusing on the page of some book or index number on the spine close up, I would focus so close that the peripheral vision blurred, and then I would see things seen for an instant in the corners of my vision, out of focus and far away, shapes that would dart between the stacks or stand just on the edge of where I was looking, watching, until I looked more closely or turned for a better look at nothing. The eerie feeling on that 6th floor got worse when things started to move. A book, firmly placed upon a shelf, would fall with a deafening thud to the ground, despite there being no reason for it to have moved. Other books, laid flat on a desk up from where I was working, would have their pages slowly curled and turned. I swear to God I stood and watched that very thing happen myself on more than one occasion, sometimes shouting out the empty space filled with books, "Who's there?" only to receive no answer. My friends explained the books moving as just the wind, though I often wondered aloud how it was that the wind not only turned the page, but then slowly, very slowly, so that it stood completely upright for several seconds, turned it back again. Surely, if the wind was blowing, it would blow from one direction, I would say. Whatever the reason, it was enough for me to decide that I no longer wanted to work on the 6th floor, and I asked to change to another part of the library, on the checkout desks or in the catalogues. Not a week had gone by after I'd switched, when another young grad student by the name of Emma was heard screaming from somewhere above our heads. Before I even asked, I knew which part of the library she was in. According to Emma, she had been stacking books and replacing them in their correct positions, somewhere along one of the rows. She had realized in doing this that one large volume, some text on the religions of the Near East, was in the wrong position. She lifted the heavy tome with both hands out of its position, intending to replace it with the book that should have been there, when she happened to glance into the place left by the book. What she should have seen was either the pages of the book placed on the shelf on the other side, spine facing out, or an empty space, if no book was occupying that position. What she saw instead, according to her, was a face, or at least part of a face. An eye as yellow, she said, as the yolk of an egg, with a pupil that was not round but vertical in a slit, like the eye of a goat. But it was not a goat, for the face she saw a portion of, framed by books on either side, had a human mouth, with straight grey lips. So dry, she said that they looked as if they might crumble away. Emma ran, tumbling over books, and screamed so loud that half the library came to investigate. No one else was on that floor. The CCTV confirmed that no one else had entered through the double doors. It did not, however, reach far enough onto the 6th floor to show who or what might have been standing between the rows and peering through them at Emma. By the time summer, finals, and the next set of late shifts rolled around, I had made it very plain that I and the other staff would not be venturing onto that floor after dark. If you look at the official notices for that particular university library, which I'm sure you can find online, or you ask anyone who attended that uni in the last 4 years, you will be able to confirm that the library stays open 24 hours during the periods that I mentioned. You will also be able to confirm that all sections of the library are open at night, right up to this day. All that is, except for the 6th floor, which, without any word of explanation, remains steadfastly closed after dark.